The event will begin in 5 minutes.
سيبدأ الحدث في غضون 5 دقائق.
Please be seated. The event is about to begin.
يرجى منكم التكرم بالجلوس. سيبدأ الحدث بعد قليل.
Please be seated. The event is about to begin.
يرجى منكم التكرم بالجلوس. سيبدأ الحدث بعد قليل.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. We are about to start in 30 seconds, let's say. So please have your seats and we will begin very shortly. Assalamu alaikum once again, and good afternoon. I hope you had a very enjoyable second day here at WEP. So my name is Ali Nasser. I will be your MC for the evening, and part of my duties here is to freshen you up and get you ready for our next panel. And we're all young here and full of energy, so I don't think I have to do that. We're actually so young, some of you are gonna go home tonight and play League of Legends. And if you don't know that game, it means that you're not so young, so you can sleep early tonight. But before you do that, let me tell you how much I'm enjoying this perspective right here. Me seeing you all reaping the benefits of what WEP has to offer. I do remember once being in your seats, actually twice. I did take WEP twice. And I don't have to tell you why I had to take WEP twice. Besides the food that we have to check in. And also, speaking of checking in, if you haven't checked in yet, yesterday we had a couple people who forgot to check in, so please, this is your reminder to do so with one of our wonderful volunteers, unless you want to enjoy taking WEP twice. But with all due seriousness, I have enjoyed taking WEP. every single time, I take something from WEP back with me to the lab, to my studies, and to my day-to-day life, and I hope you all do the same. Not to take up so much of your time, today's panel is all about the Red Sea coral reefs, and the panel is going to be moderated by Professor Michael Berman. Professor Michael Berman is an avid jigsaw puzzle solver, and he has participated in jigsaw competitions before. He is also the Associate Dean of Bessie Division here at KAUST. He is from the United States. He's finished his graduate studies in Australia. Without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Michael Berman.
Thank you. Welcome back. And just in case any of my bosses are listening, the order is at first I do the KAUST and Associate Dean work and the puzzle stuff comes later. I think most of you here last night. Can you get a whip whip? Let's see if we can keep that going. Tonight's theme is about marine systems, and we have a panel discussion. So this WEP, we're going to have almost alternating every night, a keynotes type of speaker and a panel. So we're going back and forth between panels and keynotes. So tonight we have a panel. The underlying theme of this discussion is about stressors in marine systems and what that means for the ability of these systems to recover from disturbances. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our panel speakers, our panelists. We're going to do short introductions one at a time, then we're going to come and actually start a panel discussion. So I'll move on to introduce our first panelist is Professor Sam Purkis, who has his PhD from the University of Amsterdam. He is a geologist and has interests in deep time perspectives. He has a lot of experience with remote sensing technologies and things that we can, data that we can collect from satellites observing Earth. He also has a lot of experience working deep in the ocean, so you'll see a little bit about that. And I think as most geologists would tell you, he believes that we can use the past to predict the future. And so let's welcome Sam Purkis as our first panelist.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thanks to the entire organizing committee. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what I do myself, which is primarily using new technologies to look at coral reefs at a higher fidelity in better ways. And those could be reefs in the modern world or reefs which are hundreds of millions of years old. And so this is an example on your right here. No, sorry, it's your left. Let's get that right. On your left, you have what we would see a coral reef from satellite. And it's a sort of blurred image. But what I show on the other side there is some new technologies that we've been developing to really, really see coral reefs at high resolution using drones. And this is a technology that I developed with my colleague Vade Charayev at University of Miami. And what we're using here is the water surface like a lens. So of course, as you have waves traveling across a water surface, it magnifies and demagnifies the seafloor. We've come up with a technology called the fluid cam, where we just take the parts of the image which have been intensely magnified by the sea surface. So it's using the ocean like a magnifying glass, and it gives an incredible view of the ocean floor. So we have a drone image offshore Guam of a coral reef, and then we apply that technology here, and it completely removes the water. And so now we can see the reef at very, very high resolution indeed, right down to the scale where not only can we identify the corals themselves to the level of genus or sometimes species, but we can also count the fish. So what we're essentially doing here is the sort of work that divers would do over scales of tens or hundreds of square meters, but now using remote sensing technology, we can do it over hundreds of square kilometers or thousands of square kilometers. So it's a way of upscaling measurements of biodiversity in the ocean. Anyway, that's the sort of work I do, and I will pass it back to Mike, and you can meet the rest of the panelists.
Thank you. Yeah. All right, thank you, Sam. Our next panelist is from right here in KAUST, Professor Maggie Johnson. She has her PhD from the University of California at San Diego. Maggie is an expert in marine plants and algae, and in particular, she's got special interest in particular types of algae that calcify and that actually help build the reef. Maggie's also interested in climate change and the resultant impact on ocean acidity, as well as the deoxygenation, the loss of oxygen levels. Maggie is also an expert in generally with benthic biodiversity and is helping actually teach a class this semester about benthic biodiversity. And she's had a lot of experience with various approaches for monitoring coral reefs. So I'm going to hand it over to Maggie and let her introduce a little bit more about herself. So please welcome Maggie.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike, for the introduction, and to the WEP panel for the invitation to be here. It's lovely to see you all here, for those of you who have to be here and those of you who are choosing to be here. As Mike mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the Marine Science program, and my group is the Global Change Ecology Lab. So what we're studying is coral reefs and how they are affected by changes in the environment that are due to local stressors as well as global stressors. So we're talking about coral reefs. What you're looking at here in this picture is a beautiful, thriving, healthy coral reef from the Central Line Islands, not from the Red Sea. But what you can see here are the corals in the foreground building the three-dimensional structure for the reef. We know reefs are important for biodiversity of marine habitats and a variety of reasons, but unfortunately what we're seeing is that coral reefs are becoming degraded across the planet. And this is really what is one of the main focuses of my research. And one of the things that drives me to continue this research is seeing these changes in our coral reef habitats and trying to understand what's happening and why it's happening. So what you're looking at in this picture here are corals that have bleached. Okay, so corals are sensitive to changes in temperature, and an undeniable fact is that temperatures are increasing across the globe. Ocean water temperatures are increasing, and this is happening rapidly. It becomes a point where corals can no longer withstand the temperature stress, and they spit out their algal symbionts, and they become bleached. So that's what you're seeing here. If they stay bleached, then they often die, and that's what we're seeing happening across the globe. The Red Sea is a really unique and interesting habitat, and we'll talk about outliers going on a little bit further, but it's really interesting for this natural extreme environment that we have, really warm temperatures, salty conditions, and so it provides a lot of insight into what coral reefs might look like in the future. Now, as Mike mentioned, my group studies predominantly algae on coral reefs. Okay, so these are sometimes referred to as seaweeds. They're benthic primary producers, so they're photosynthetic. In this photo here, you're not looking at corals, you're looking at algae that are living on a coral reef. The pink bubblegum structure that you see here is actually a crustose coralline algae, or a calcified algae. This is an alga that produces a limestone skeleton, and it's important for building the reef, much like corals are. But not a lot of research attention focuses on these types of taxa. They're pink rocks, essentially, but they have a really important role on the coral reef ecosystem. And so the work that my group is doing here at KAUST is, first, trying to get a handle on what species we have for different types of algae in the Red Sea, understanding how they're changing in the community over time, and evaluating how they're affected by stressors in the environment. So things like changes in temperature, acidity, oxygen, and so forth. And with that, I'll hand it back to Mike so we can move on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Maggie. Next up, we have Dr. Andrew Temple, who is also here at KAUST. He's a postdoc. He has his PhD from Newcastle University. Andrew is an expert on fisheries. And in particular, Andrew is interested in how certain types of pressures, such as climate change, affect fisheries. He has a huge amount of experience working in areas where we have almost no data about fisheries, and especially where those areas where the fisheries are small scale, not with huge fishing fleets or huge boats, but small scale fisheries. Here in the Red Sea, he's turned his attention to some of the overfishing challenges. He has, before the Red Sea, a lot of experience in East Africa, He also has particular interest in elasmobranchs, so sharks and rays, and especially some of the deep sea fish that may be the target of fisheries. So please welcome Dr. Andrew.
Thank you, Mike, for the introduction, and thank you again to the organizing committee for inviting us to participate in the panel. So I'm a fisheries scientist. Fisheries, along with foraging and along with hunting, is one of the three, if you like, ancient methods of obtaining food. And so it's really one of the key activities that humanity and the development of, I guess, civilization has based itself upon. But it is the only one of those three remaining that's really important to the production of food for countries and societies across the globe. And throughout that time, since the invention of agriculture, which largely phased out hunting and foraging, fisheries has diversified into all sorts of areas of the world, proliferated across the globe, but it's also diversified from the very basic, if you like, ancient fishing techniques that are still used in many areas of the world. A single person going out on a boat with a hook and line and sitting on the water for 12 hours a day catching what they can, to enormous super trawlers and industrial fisheries that stretch across the globe, harvesting tuna in the open ocean, krill and things like that in the polar region. So really spread across the globe completely. But it's also made its way into our kind of daily lives for those that take up fishing as a hobby. And all those things come together to impact the marine environment. Fishing has a well-documented, troublesome past with the sustainability of the marine environment, and that goes from anything from oyster reefs in Europe, where they dredged many of those out, and a lot of those ecosystems are gone completely, to things like historical industrial whaling, where we've seen massive declines in the health of those ecosystems and the status of those species. And even though those things have been managed for many, many years, they still haven't recovered to their sort of pre-existing levels. And then that's just an example of like the targeted component of a fishery. The other problem we have in fisheries is all the things that we catch accidentally when we're fishing for specific things that we want. And we see mass declines in many species as a result of that. A lot of those are kind of the iconic species get the focus, the sharks, the rays, turtles, mammals, and so on. But it affects species of all shapes and sizes. And even if we just zoom in on fish themselves, something like a quarter of all fish species are threatened in some way by fisheries. And if we look at only threatened species, that increases to about a third. And for things like sharks and rays, every single threatened species within that group is as a result directly of fishing. And that's just the extractive process, but fishing also has a sort of an important pollution component. So there's obviously a lot of focus on pollution in the ocean and plastics and so on. And fishing contributes very heavily to that. So if we're thinking about the large plastics drifting around the ocean, something like half of that comes directly from the fishing industry. But it's not something we can just do away with completely. Fishing is really important for the production of food, it's really important for the production of wealth, but it's also really integral to the cultural history of many nations and many societies. And in lots of parts of the world, it's a really foundational component of communities and how people come together and who they are as people. Many people who are engaged in fishing consider themselves to be a fisher or a fisherman almost from birth. It's who they were born to be, it's what they are and what they do. And so I think it's a particularly interesting stressor, which is one that we very much have control over, one that we would like to eliminate the threat from, but something we can't live without either. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Our final panelist is Professor Jodie Rummer, who has her PhD from the University of British Columbia in Canada, but she has come all the way to KAUST from James Cook University in Australia. So she's made a huge trip to get here. I failed to mention that Sam has come all the way from Miami, which is pretty far, but Jodie's come from Australia, which is further. So thank you for making that trip. Jodie is an expert on physiology and also on sharks. She's very interested in how these animals can deal with stress and how they tolerate stress in their environment. She does very nice work combining lab and field work together. And so something that you should feel very, very sorry for marine science students. And marine science students out there, you put your hands up, or marine scientists, put your hands up. You know, one of the really terrible things, you know, pass your condolences to them, because sometimes we really have to work in very awful places in the world, like French Polynesia, where Jodie spends a huge amount of time. So that's one of the tough parts of the job. But Jodie is going to round out our panel, so I'll give her the stage to introduce her topic. Let's welcome Jodie from Australia.
Thank you, Professor Berriman, and thanks to the whole WEP committee. It's been absolutely a huge honor to be here and to share some of the work that I've been privileged to carry out over the past couple decades, and exploring some of the physiological performance of fishes, including coral reef fishes and sharks, and how they're coping with stress. So I'd like to begin by highlighting two of the species that have shaped a lot of my research: the epaulet, or the walking shark, because it can do just that, and newborn life stages of the blacktip reef shark. These species have allowed me to, and my team, to investigate how organisms from the most imperiled vertebrate taxa, the sharks, respond to environmental stress, and not just today, but as a window into the future of marine ecosystems and how they might cope with climate change. So the epaulet shark is endemic to the Great Barrier Reef, which I do a lot of my work on. We've got genetically and geographically distinct populations extending 2,300 kilometers along the east coast of Australia. They're remarkable not only because they hatch from eggs, which you can see in the image here, but also my team has successfully closed its life cycle in the laboratory, meaning that we can investigate this species and how it responds to stress across all life stages, from embryos all the way to adults, while comparing these responses to what we observe in the wild or in the field with our work. This shark species is a true bioindicator species. It's renowned for its ability to tolerate extremely low, even zero oxygen conditions, fluctuating temperatures of the reef flats where it inhabits, and it makes a really powerful model for understanding resilience. Now, my work on the blacktip reef sharks is based in the largest shark sanctuary in the world, French Polynesia. It's denoted by an area that's here on the map. Area 9 spans 4.8 million square kilometers, where sharks are culturally revered, but also protected completely from all fishing activities. Now, I started the physio-shark research program with colleagues on the island of Moorea, which is just off of Tahiti, back in 2013. And now we have 12 years of data from our long-term monitoring program. We've identified annually 10 nurseries around the island during baby shark season, which spans from September to about the end of February. And doing our research in a shark sanctuary where fishing is not a problem means that we can focus our research solely on the effects of climate change. Now, these nurseries, although quite idyllic, quite beautiful, are challenging places for baby sharks. They're shallow, they're coastal, they experience fluctuating conditions like temperature, oxygen, pH, as well as runoff and coastal developments. But these shallows are presumably what are keeping them safe from large predators on the reef and provide a lot of food sources so these sharks can grow as quickly as possible. Now we'll take measurements, we'll take DNA samples, blood, we'll tag the sharks, and if we recapture them, we can determine their growth rates and other aspects of their health. And of course, working in a shark sanctuary, all of our experiments are non-lethal. We return and release all of our sharks back to the original capture locations. Now, we can pair these data with environmental data as well, like temperature, pH, oxygen, and we can do laboratory tolerance experiments to determine how close these sharks are living, how close to the edge these baby sharks are living. We can see what their thresholds are and how they're using these nursery habitats during this really critical period of their early life. Now, for over 450 million years, sharks have navigated the Earth and all of these challenging ocean conditions. Coral reef fishes, a little bit of a shorter evolutionary history, they've also shown some amazing adaptation. Lots of fluctuating extreme conditions. But for me, after 13 years of my career, my research on the Great Barrier Reef, arguably one of the best managed marine protected areas in the world, and in French Polynesia, the benchmark for shark protection, shark sanctuaries, one thing is absolutely clear, is even the best protected marine environments cannot escape the effects of climate change. It's crossing all of these boundaries, and it's pushing a lot of these really amazing species closer and closer to their physiological limits. So that's my research. Thank you very much.
We're now going to create the panel. We're all going to be here. We're going to have a small panel discussion, and then I want you all to be thinking about questions, because after we have a few conversations, short conversations, we're going to ask you for some questions to keep the conversation going. So let's get going. The theme for this WEP is outliers, and one of the things that we talked about a little bit last night is what really that means and how we can look for positive aspects in identifying outliers. And as scientists, although we may have this inherent fear of an outlier, I'd like for each of you to give us an example or a thought about some kind of outlier from your area of expertise or your work that you think is something that we can learn from. Maybe we'll start with Andrew.
Sure. So an example I would say from the fisheries research areas, if we're considering outliers as we usually think about outliers in our data, and we're really studying the average, and that's what we tend to be interested in, that's also how we tend to think about fishers and fishermen and how they operate. We think about them as one big cohesive unit. But in reality, there is quite a spread of different behaviors and different ways people operate. And so if we think about bycatch fisheries, which is what I'm interested in, that's the accidental catch of species that we're not necessarily looking for, that don't necessarily have value. How that's distributed across different fishermen follows the Pareto distribution, roughly. So the idea is you can think of it like 20% of the bycatch comes from 80% of the fishermen, and vice versa, 80% of the bycatch comes from 20% of the fishermen. And so there's a lot to learn in those extremes in terms of I guess you could think of them as high-skilled fishermen that are very active in the fishery. They catch a lot of what they're going for and very little of the things that we generally want to avoid. And similarly, at the opposite end, the fishermen or the fishers who are going out and catching very little of what they're looking for and catching a whole host of things that they don't want. And in those extremes, we can learn a lot about different behaviors and different ways of operating at sea that would allow us to avoid some of the issues that we currently face in fisheries.
Yeah, great. So the concept of outliers is particularly interesting for studying effects of environmental change on organisms. And so if we think about the Red Sea, and I had mentioned briefly in my talk that the Red Sea has really warm temperatures, and those sometimes can be considered outliers in and of themselves. But what's really interesting is that those extreme conditions can actually facilitate adaptation and acclimation in some organisms to extreme temperatures. And so an example from the work that we're doing is that there are some species of algae. So if we're thinking about crustose coral and algae, the same can actually apply to corals as well. There are some species that are better adapted to dealing with warmer temperatures, for example. And so from some of the experiments that we've done in the field here and in the lab, we find that there are some species that average response to increasing temperatures is that they are negatively affected. They're stressed, they don't grow as well. But the interesting part is where we have these outliers that respond positively or don't respond to those extreme environmental conditions. So for example, a species of crustose coralline algae that continues to grow just as fast even when we increase temperatures by 4 to 6 degrees. That gives us some hope that there are some organisms that may be able to withstand changes in temperature associated with climate change, and we can focus on those individuals and those organisms to try to get a better idea for who we may have on future coral reefs, and if there are any particular characteristics about those species that make them better adapted, and hopefully use that to find solutions for other species and other taxa as we work towards restoration and conservation efforts.
Yeah, so Mike, the more I work in the Red Sea, I see the Red Sea itself as an outlier. And this really came from the outlier opportunity that we both had, actually, when we started to work in the deep Red Sea with Ocean X and their incredible Ocean Explorer research vessel. And when you look out the window here and you look at the Red Sea, it seems to be a tranquil, unchanging environment. But you shouldn't be deceived by that appearance. When we look in the deep sea, we see evidence of extreme earthquakes in even just recent human history. We see deposits in the deep sea which have been laid down by really sizable tsunami caused by those earthquakes. And so you think of this as just a gentle, sort of tranquil area, but this is a boisterous young ocean which is being built. You know, so it's geologically very, very dynamic, but also environmentally. So also what we've found from that work in the deep is you only have to go back a couple of 100 years, and it was a much, much wetter climate, perhaps raining twice as much as it is today. Go back 400 years and there's 5 times as much rain. You imagine if you're in this area here, you'd have abundant lions and leopards and wolves in the mountains around here, like totally different environment, but just a few centuries ago. So it's a very dynamic sea, and that dynamism also breeds biodiversity. And as you know, some of the reefs here are some of the most biodiverse on Earth. We have a high level of endemism, species that only live in the Red Sea, which is a direct result of those conditions, those dynamic conditions. So I would propose that the Red Sea itself is an outlier.
And I might just interject that if you want to hear more, this is a shameless plug for Sam's keynote talk tomorrow, which will be about the green Arabia of the past. So, but save that for tomorrow. Jodie.
Yeah, I guess building off of my introduction, I look at species that stand out as really remarkable outliers and what they can teach us, or how they can help us expand our understanding of all the biological possibilities, the boundaries of resilience. Some of these species, like the 2 that I showed you, are thriving in environments that are normally pushing the limits for physiological performance and survival. And so studying their performance and studying their survival can help us understand the mechanisms, those traits that are really important, and those that we might need to look for in other species in order for other species to be able to thrive under climate change, under future ocean conditions. And I think some of these species, some of these life stages offer a lot of really unique possibilities for us as scientists to understand. What does resilience mean? What does adaptation mean? And especially in the face of some of these extreme conditions that our oceans are facing, and how they might respond to some of these scenarios into the future. So I look at species as outliers.
Now, I don't want to make this an overly depressing or heavy conversation, but I think that we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of stresses that, as you've all touched on some of them, that face our marine systems today. We will come back to more positive aspects, but let me add, are there particular things that you think we should be really concerned about? I don't know if somebody wants to tackle it. Jodie, you want to start?
I mean, I think as you would have noticed from my introduction, I have a lot of concern for the future of the oceans, for the future of coral reefs, and for the future of these species that are so important to the functions of these ecosystems and the functions of these ecosystems that we depend on as humans as well. You know, we're looking at amazing, remarkable examples like the Great Barrier Reef, like the shark sanctuaries that I showed on the map, but particularly something like French Polynesia. We can look at programs for conservation that are helping with that. But I think as some of these marine species face more frequent and more severe environmental stressors and these, you know, cyclones and bleaching events that just become more frequent and stop becoming unprecedented and become precedented. And it's that rapid pace at which their habitats are changing due to these changes that ultimately we're causing. That's what really, really, I guess, alarms me. We're looking at those vulnerable life stages like newborns or pregnant mothers that really, I guess, are responsible for ensuring those next generations. And that's what could signal a broader collapse in some of these ecosystems and their functions that we rely on.
Andrew, do you want to comment anything else?
Sure. I mean, I guess you alluded to this a little bit or my interest in this a little bit in your introduction, which was, it's not also, or one of the worries I have is that we, and I certainly have been guilty of this in the past, have a tendency to silo into our specific stresses, if you like, of interest. So, you know, fisheries is my bias, other people's is climate change. But they're obviously not acting separately either. And so, you know, I could focus all of my work on just looking at fisheries and how we can manage fisheries, how we could do that sustainably, and so on. But there's synergistic effects that combine across different stresses as well. And so, you know, I could almost think of this as, you know, we do the work, or let's say we manage the fishery correctly, or what we believe to be correctly, and so our job is done, right? That stressor is gone, that's not a problem. But especially with things like that, that's a stressor that in some sense we can't live without, we need to keep harvesting, so it's not ever going to be a case of no fishing. But even the presence of what we believe is sustainable fishing could be exacerbating the effects of other stressors that we're perhaps not thinking about at that time when we're designing those management strategies and management plans. And so I guess that's in some ways one of my larger concerns is, you know, even if we can solve some of these individual problems, solving the overarching combination of problems is much more complicated and something that's going to take, you know, a lot longer than necessarily just the individual components.
Okay, so let's turn it around then and say, are there some things that you're optimistic about? Are there reasons to be optimistic? Do you want to carry on from your answer?
Sure. Well, I was kind of in the same vein, is that, you know, we largely understand these stresses. We largely understand what's causing it, what the solution to some degree needs to be. So whether that's control of fishing, whether that's the slowing of progress of the change in climates, or at least the anthropogenic component of that. But it's one thing to know what we need to do, it's another thing to implement that. And so the optimism is born out of knowing what to do. The challenge remains is, can we do that quick enough? Do we have the capacity, the willingness, and can we do it at the pace that we need to do to get there?
Yeah, I'll add to that as well. So I want to give an example of a positive example of reefs that are doing pretty well in the world, because we hear a lot of times about, and even as I was talking about reefs becoming more degraded across the world, temperature and local impacts, things like fishing, nutrient pollution, and all of that are changing the face of reef ecosystems. But on some of the reefs that I work on in the Central Pacific, for example, where there are no human populations, I mean, we're talking it takes days to get to some of these islands by boat. We actually see that the coral reefs there are doing remarkably well, even though they're experiencing the same increases in temperature that we're seeing in some other places. So for example, in the bleaching event that happened in 2015, so there was a period of warming where we lost a lot of coral reef across the world from increasing temperatures, there was bleaching, mass mortality. So we saw some of these reefs bleach during that event. So the specific example here that I'm talking about is from the Southern Line Islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. No people, okay? So there's no fishing pressure, there's no local pollution from nutrients, chemicals, etc. So a lot of this reef bleached during that bleaching event 2015, but when we went back a few years later to see how it was doing, much of that coral had actually recovered. And so when we remove some of those extra stressors, the local stressors that we might be able to control a little bit better individually than something like temperature increase, then we actually see that some of these reefs still have the potential to withstand that environmental change. And so that is an example of some hope that we have out there, that if we can work on managing some of these local stressors, like fishing, nutrient pollution, et cetera, then we may be able to give some of these ecosystems a little bit of a break to withstand changes in temperature and pH and oxygen that we're seeing happening with global stressors.
So one of the things that maybe the audience is not as familiar with, but if you're working in the marine field, you probably hear a phrase called 30 by 30. And this is a commitment of a whole bunch of different countries around the world that each of them is committing that they will protect 30% of their marine areas by the year 2030. So we talk about this 30 by 30 goal, and it's been, Saudi is one of the countries that is planning to try to achieve that goal. But my question is, are those still the right kind of initiatives? Are those plans going to work? Is that, do we need to revisit those ideas? What do you think? Anyone have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, Mike. I think the basic premise of how you conserve the ocean and conserve biodiversity is well established now. And marine protected areas, they work. But it's really now a case of giving them the time to do the work that they need to do. And from my own career, I've done a lot of work, for instance, out in the central Indian Ocean, in the Chagos archipelago, very, very remote, which was an early, very, very large MPA. And I think the take-home from that is there's really 6 key ingredients that you need to have a successful MPA. First of all, it's got to be no-take. There's no, and let me just clarify, by MPA, I mean a marine protected area. So it's an area of the ocean which is set aside and managed in a very nimble way. So it's got to be no-take. It's got to be well enforced. There's no point declaring a part of the ocean as protected and then still allowing people to extract from it. The third thing, is the benefits of protecting the ocean come slowly. It takes at least 10 years before you really start to see the effect of an MPA, and that's a long time to wait. But I will add to that if you wait that decade, then the benefits come really quite quickly. And just as Maggie said, you've got to separate that area from human pressures. The remoter, the better. And these areas also have to be really large. So we're not talking hundreds or thousands of square kilometers. We're really talking millions of square kilometers, huge swaths of the ocean. And then finally, if you're going to conserve an area, you have to know what you're conserving. And that's the sort of technology that I work on myself, is finding better ways to map and monitor from orbit. So I think the basic premise of ocean conservation is well established and the science is good. What's changing, though, is the pace, the rate that the planet is warming. And so, from my own opinion, we still need to stick to those sort of agreements, but there's a more compelling urgency now to implement them quicker as the planet is warming faster than we'd originally expected.
Yeah, I can add to that, and I absolutely agree with the 6 key elements. I think that's brilliant. I think 30 by 30 has immense potential to do what we think it should do: protect biodiversity, support ecosystem resilience, help mitigate the effects of climate change. 2030 is in less than 5 years. So I really want to emphasize what Sam has mentioned is the urgency in which we need to be doing these things. Also, I think that the effectiveness of these strategies, yes, we know that marine protected areas work, but they hinge more on just spatial coverage. We need robust enforcement. We need integration of climate smart strategies, so integrating the problem of climate change into these plans. We need to be prioritizing ecologically significant, vulnerable areas, including those that are beyond national jurisdictions. So I use my example of French Polynesia as what I think is the gold standard right now in terms of a shark sanctuary. It is 4.8 million square kilometers. It is the largest in the world. But a lot of those species cross those boundaries. You know, just because we put dotted lines around an area doesn't mean that everything inside that is going to stick inside that area and stay protected. Okay, we've got migratory species. So we need to be revisiting a lot of these marine protected areas. We need to be refining them regularly, and we need to be doing so to address these emerging challenges. So looking at how they might be affected by species distribution changes, intensifying stressors due to climate change. And to go back to my example, we've had a really big win just this past year. A question that I get with my work is, oh, well, Jodie, like if you're already working in the largest shark sanctuary in the world, what more can be done? How much more can you do to protect the sharks in that area? Well, we absolutely can. So we can do so spatially and temporally. I've identified the 10 nurseries and the time period in which baby sharks are occurring in those 10 nurseries. And so because of that, we had 6 of those nurseries already this past year established as important shark and ray areas. And so that's on top of being a shark sanctuary. So now we know, and the general public knows, and hopefully the world will know, that those areas need extra protection during those periods of time, and that's due to our work. So I think that there's always more that can be done, and that a lot of these things have to be revisited frequently.
Let me bring you back to a local question in our backyard. So Maggie, Andrew, what does the near future for the Red Sea look like?
I can start by talking a little bit about the benthic community. Leave the fish to Andrew. So the benthic community, that refers to the things that are living on the bottom of the seafloor. So our corals, our calcifying algae, and other things that are associated with the seafloor. I mean, to be honest, I would say that the near future for the Red Sea, particularly the central and southern Red Sea, looks pretty grim. What we saw over the last year and even the year before that was pretty extensive bleaching. And so we used to think that bleaching happened maybe only in the southern Red Sea, a little bit in the central Red Sea, but we're seeing that the proportion of the benthic community that bleaches, the corals that bleach, extending farther into the north. And so while the northern Red Sea seems to still be doing pretty well because the temperatures are cooler, we are seeing that more corals in different places in the Red Sea are bleaching and then dying. And so even in the short time that I've been here, so I've now been at KAUST for 3 years, the reefs just off the shore of KAUST have changed remarkably. And that's as a result of increasing temperatures and marine heat waves. And so the benthic community is definitely changing. And what we see when corals die is that the community shifts towards dominance or coverage by things that are not contributing to reef building. And this includes things like fleshy seaweeds, maybe other soft-bodied taxa. And so that coral reef doesn't have the same ecological function. It's not able to provide the same services to people, to support the same fish. And so the near future, I would say, looks pretty grim. And so action is definitely very important in managing these systems. It's not, hope isn't lost. There's certainly things that we can do. An example of something that may help as we move into the near future is, for example, the KCRI, the KAUST Coral Restoration Initiative, that's working at Shusha Island to outplant and restore coral up in the Neom region. So there are things like that that are happening that could potentially help as we move into the future, but action definitely needs to happen now?
I think in the same vein, my general message would be the likelihood is it will get worse before it gets better. Part of that is down to timelines, like Sam mentioned. You know, you're talking 5, 10, 15 years if you implement change now before you see the effects of that kind of change. And I think the Red Sea is also particularly challenging because it's an enclosed basin. It's bordered by a large number of different countries. Each of those countries has its own challenges that they have to deal with. Obviously, there's a lot of the neighboring states here have issues. There's civil war, there's political strife, humanitarian strife, things like that in different parts. But because the basin is so enclosed and so well linked together, seemingly, what's happening in those countries will affect what happens here. And similarly, there are things that Saudi can do in terms of improving the state of the management of its ocean that could have knock-on effects, but because it's linked to these other countries, they need to be doing it as a kind of joint linked-up effort. Otherwise, you know, the extent of impact that can be had from the actions that we take here will be constrained by what's happening elsewhere. But similarly, we have the potential to benefit from what happens in other countries. So, you know, if we're able to overcome some of those challenges, then it's certainly possible that we will get, at the very least, a slowing, let's say, of the current biodiversity loss that's ongoing here and in many other places. And the potential that if we get to a place where we can level that out and then maybe look, we're then looking forward to can we restore what was here before and start to recover back to those previous efforts. But it's going to take a lot of work here. It's going to take a lot of joint-up efforts with other countries, and it's going to take time, even if we can get those initiatives right and those decisions right, even now.
So I'm going to ask a backward-looking question a little bit, in the sense that someone could. I mean, Jodie, I think you mentioned in your introduction, sharks have been around for 450 million years. Corals have been around for a couple hundred million years. Why should we be worried about them? I mean, it seems like you might argue that they'll be fine.
Well, that's the beauty of being a geologist, because as a geologist, you have the long view in time. I mean, as you say, reefs as a concept have been around for 500 million years. And it's blasé to throw out, numbers like that. That's an unimaginable length of time. And corals, like we have on modern reefs today, modern corals have been around for 240 million years. And they have survived the biggest crises that Earth can throw at them. I mean, when we talk about warming temperatures now, it's nothing compared to the temperature changes which were going on 100 million years ago. Radical changes in ocean chemistry, radical changes in sea level, going up and down by hundreds of meters. Yet corals have persisted through all of that time, and reefs have been built. And that's really a paradox. It's hard to reconcile what we've just been talking about, which make corals appear like pandas. There's nothing you can do to save them. You even try to save them, and they'll actually resist you trying to save them. They just want to die. It's very, very frustrating. But the paradox is they've survived the extinction of the dinosaurs and so on and so forth. Now, if you look in more detail at how they've performed through time, the situation is a little bit more worrying. So Earth has had 5 great mass extinctions and a myriad of other crises sort of intersperse, interleave with those. And reefs and the organisms that build them, like corals, it seems that they are affected by those crises worse than most other marine organisms. So it's not actually a paradox. They are very vulnerable. And then the thing is, after a crisis and extinction, the reef-building organisms take a very long time to return. We're measuring that in millions or tens of millions of years. I mean, and that's also very, blasé to say words like that, but that's a really long time. 1 million years is a long time, and tens of millions of years is unimaginable. So I think what we learn from the geological record is that these complex systems, like a reef, they take a long time to build in the first place, and they take a long time to rebuild if you disturb them. So as a geologist, I'm not worried about reefs. They're going to come back. There's no need to worry, but we might have to wait millions of years. And you ask, why should we be worried? Well, of course, the sort of recovery that we've seen is not on human timescales, and we're going to be long gone. There's nothing to worry about the reefs, but if you want reefs to be experienced by our children and grandchildren, there's a lot to worry about.
Yeah, I can sort of riff off of what Sam has said with time being the key here. The current rate of change that we're seeing that's driven by human activities, the rate of warming that we're seeing is what's unprecedented. But not only that, it's, and unlike with the 5 major extinction events that the sharks have lived through, or even adaptation events, today's challenges are quite multifaceted. So we're seeing overfishing, as Andrew has talked about. We've seen habitat destruction, we've seen pollution, and climate change are all acting simultaneously. And so that's really what's concerning, is the rate at which this is changing in our lifetime, essentially. In my lifetime, it's happened. And that's what's reducing the biodiversity and weakening these ecosystems. And even those really resilient species are being pushed to their physiological limits. So I think the time and then the fact that we've got these multiple stressors acting simultaneously. Just 3 days ago, the World Meteorological Organization confirmed that, like, once again, we've had another hottest year on record with 2024, with global temperatures exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius for every single day of the year. And so that's 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And so we know that that's the warming combined with things like ocean acidification, ocean deoxygenation, that's outpacing the ability of many of these species to adapt. And when we're looking at some of these long-lived species, like the sharks, that have those long generation times, not enough generations can go by in time in order to keep pace with the rate at which their habitat, their environment is changing, okay? So, some of the sharks I investigate, they actually have pretty short generation times, 8 years to reach sexual maturity. Look what's happened in 8 years. So it's the time, I think, that's the most alarming.
Last question that I'm going to ask, so you guys start thinking. The last question I'm going to ask is about technology. So what technologies do you see coming that might be game changers, that might make a difference in this conversation? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting time. I mean, there are some great new technologies that are coming online. Myself, I work with satellites and drones, and like I showed in my introduction, we're getting close to being able to scale up the sort of measurements that divers make up to regional scale, maybe even global scale in a few years from now. So we're going to understand the functioning of reefs and their condition much better than we do today, and that's exciting. But in that, there's also a warning, is it's always tempting to monitor reefs. If you talk to any organization or development project, they're like, oh, we're going to monitor the reefs, we're going to monitor the reefs. Like, monitoring reefs never saved a reef. You just sort of document its demise in excruciating detail. So you've got to be careful with technology not to be drawn into that trap. I mean, everything about conserving reefs is about action. And unfortunately, there's no technology on Earth which is going to do that. This is now about social and political change. We have to change the way we live. We have to change the way we treat the ocean. And that's not a technological challenge. It's a societal challenge. So I'm very excited about new technologies. I think we're going to understand reefs much better, and we're going to understand how to recondition them, make them better, stop stressing them. But then the hard part comes is that we have to change our behaviors.
Any other thoughts? Andrew?
Well, I guess I could play the satellite imaging and AI technology angle as well, which is, in the fisheries field, one of the big advances has been the ability to monitor vessel activity at sea. Obviously, there are large parts of the ocean, whether that be because they're far offshore and away from where managers are operating and where we're able to observe, or just because it's in areas of the ocean where we don't have very much understanding of where the vessels are going, where the fishermen are going, even in many cases where the reefs themselves are that they're visiting, the fishermen know they're there, they're at sea every day, but we don't know where they are or where the reef is. The use of satellite technology and the automation of tracking of vessels using satellite imagery has really helped us move forward very quickly in understanding those things in those areas, which is great. It still has limitations, largely on the scale of the vessels, what we can actually see from space reliably and what we can detect. And so in parts of the world like Saudi, where, well, not Saudi specifically, but the tropics, the Red Sea, East Africa, where I've worked a lot before, we still can't track those vessels very easily from satellite imagery because they're largely too small, but we're getting very close. And you bring it back to the technology. That's great. We can, we're starting to see them in these places. We know where they're going, what they're doing a lot better. But it will then still come down to what we do about that. So it's all well and good knowing that someone's breaking the rules, but if you're not doing anything about either changing the rules or enforcing the rules, then they're going to keep going and breaking them, and I don't necessarily blame them if I was in their position. So technology is exciting, but what we do with it matters more than just having it in existence.
Another thing I've seen with the advent of a lot of different technologies within the marine science realm, at least, is engagement. So it's allowed us to take much more multidisciplinary and integrative approaches to the work that we're doing. Bringing in big data scientists has been amazing. Bringing in AI, machine learning, has just automated so much of what we're able to do. But not only that, but it allows us to work with scientists that we might not have worked with previously. And the other thing is that it opens doors for citizen science programs, which brings more of the general public into our realm of what we're doing, and I guess bridges that divide between the scientists and the public that are voting for conservation, that are voting for management, that are voting for protected areas. So I think that it has helped us also bring people together and make it much more of a team effort for conservation as well. So in addition to making a lot of what we do a lot more efficient, I think it's given the work that we're doing and helping us with these problems feel like we're taking much more of a community approach.
Okay, well, now it's your turn. You've got a panel of experts here. I expect you to ask some tough and interesting questions. Maybe we need a whip. All right, okay. So, questions, please. There are microphones in the aisles.
So there's the mic here and there's one here. So if you have a question, you can come here and do the line, and each one can ask the question.
Must be able to think of some question. Oh, I think somebody's coming. Thank you.
So you mentioned both engagement and like how AI is advancing, but my question for you is what can KAUST students do right now to conserve their local environment? What are the local strategies that can be used to protect corals like the Red Sea?
Well, that's a great question. I think, of course, we all know how to be better citizens of the planet, and we talk about things like reducing carbon, your consumption of carbon, changing your diet, using less plastics, etc., etc. And they're all great, and we should all be doing those. But I'm going to say this from the bottom of my heart, that if you really want to make a difference, you need to go back to the country that you come from, and it's a beautiful international cohort here, and you need to bring to power governments who are going to take these sort of problems seriously. That's how to move the needle on the crisis that we face. It's that big.
on? Hello? Thank you. So for Saudi specifically, I would also say that education and understanding of the ocean and how important it is to the kingdom is really important. And so spreading the word to your colleagues, encouraging education of the local environment so we stop polluting it, right? So there's less garbage, there's less, all of the things going into the ocean here. I think starting with education and outreach, spreading the word on that is something that you can do as well. And spreading the word to your families. Talk to the people you know. Tell them how important it is. Tell them how important the ocean is for the people and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and start spreading that word. We try to do what we can as educators and trying to reach out to more students and people, but as individuals with families and friends in the community, that's something that you can do as well.
Thank you.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for your talk. So you've spoken about pros and cons, but from what it seemed to me, even the pros had a lot of caveats. So it was all in all quite depressing, so to speak. But my point is, you've mentioned all these technologies that you use. I mean, not all, mainly drones and AI, but this is research that is not strictly for this purpose. So the reason I ask is a lot of the research that you hear these days is, of course, AI. You have a lot of stuff about medicine in terms of drug delivery, etc., cancer and whatnot. I can't even say that the research, I mean, the conservation of all, whatever it is you're trying to study, I can't even say that it takes the back seat. And at this rate, it's probably like more like roadkill. So us being a science and technology university, what sort of, maybe this is a bit of an abstract question, what sort of technologies do you think would be necessary to, develop to kind of help and solve this problem? I mean, we can't all wait for, eons for these problems to solve themselves. What can we do by ourselves, if there's anything?
Who wants to try to tackle that? Go for it.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to take from what we've said, very doom and gloom, and it feels like there are more cons than pros. Yeah. I agree with you. But, what I guess keeps me going is looking for the bright spots, looking for what's working and where it's working. Why? Why does a certain area work with conservation, for example, or why has a research program really thrived in figuring out what they've intended to figure out? Who are the key players in that story, for example? Then to answer your question about, what kinds of technologies can we be exploring? What can we all as, different types of scientists be doing? Well, yeah, what it comes down to is we need clean energy. We really do. We need to get our reliance off of fossil fuels, off of carbon, off our addiction to carbon. And, I'm looking out in this audience right now of, a couple hundred of the brightest minds in the world and the next generation that is going to solve those problems, because this is our day-to-day. This is what we're used to. We're used to big problems and figuring them out. So I think that that's where it's going. How do we get away from that? Well, okay, the marine environment, that's kind of the roadkill. We really need to focus on humans and disease and yes, absolutely. We are a pretty anthropocentric population. We do care about human health and human issues. Well, how many vaccines, drugs, pharmaceuticals come from the ocean? There's a number. I don't know that number. So many. So, I think when you're having these conversations with somebody that says, well, but what about the next pandemic? What about curing cancer? What about all these human problems? Well, if we don't have healthy oceans, we're not going to solve any of those problems, because so many of our solutions come from healthy oceans as well. So when you are having those conversations with your mates, try to connect with them on what they value and what they're concerned about, what they're scared about. And I think at the end of the day, everything does come back to having a healthy ocean.
Yeah, I completely agree with Jodie on that. And I've been a scientist for many decades now, and you read the sort of standard paper that someone's written a paper, maybe it's a new technology, and they advocate how important the oceans are for anthropogenic reasons, like, oh, this many drug discoveries, or this many people rely on coral reefs for the protein that they eat every day, and this many square kilometers of reef is worth this many billions of dollars. And I've got to say that these sort of statistics really start to leave me cold. I mean, I say it. And the reason that we want healthy oceans and we want beautiful coral reefs isn't because of the services they provide. I mean, those are very important, and the word ecosystem services just starts to give me chills now. The reason that we want to conserve the ocean is just it's incredibly beautiful. And to think of a future where your children, I mean, you're quite young, your children or your grandchildren are learning about what a coral reef was in a book, as opposed to being able to see one, you know, it's just a tragedy, isn't it? It's just a crisis. So I think a more emotional response is absolutely required, rather than just sort of trying to cast the value of the ocean in terms of dollars. It just becomes a little bit blunt. It's the most beautiful ecosystem on the planet, and we have to preserve it for that reason.
I think that, you know, if you think about, I'm going to jump in and just throw in a KAUST perspective there. KAUST work, a lot of it falls into tackling some of the really major challenges we have facing the entire world. Clean water, food for enough people, keeping people healthy. These are, you know, non-trivial problems, all of which, if you become too negative about it, it seems overwhelming, and how do we solve any of that, right? And so I think protecting the environment, protecting the oceans is on par with those challenges as well. But each of you is probably, I mean, what I would challenge is that each of you is working on some kind of project, or will work on some kind of project that may have relevance to one of those things. But where some of the biggest advances have come in technologies that we use in our field were absolutely built for some other purpose. And it was someone sitting in a room like this, someone like you, who was working on a different topic for a different reason, said, oh, maybe this could be useful in an unexpected way. And maybe that's a kind of outlier. But, you know, so everything you're doing to help make the world a better place can also be a positive view in that regard too. So, but thanks, it's a good question.
Alrighty, thank you.
I think we'll go over to this side.
Hello. I have two questions. The first one, it seems like it's too late to preserve stuff. So, like, what are you guys doing to change the, what are they called? Coral reefs. Like, I'm thinking, so the Red Sea has a high temperature compared to, let's say, the Black Sea. So we can take coral reefs from the Red Sea and then inbred them with the ones in the Black Sea. So in the Black Sea, when the temperature gets high, they can not bleach. And the second, like, and same, like, what are we trying to do other than preserve what we have to, like at least adapt to the rising temperatures? Because under capitalism, it's almost impossible to stop what's happening. And the second question is, you guys have a lot about the Red Sea, but what about the Gulf? Like, what's happening there? Because it's so polluted. I'm from the Dammam, and it's so polluted, and I don't know what's going on down there. Do we even have marine? We do have. We have. I'm so sorry. Here's a heart for you guys.
Thank you. Those are great questions, and we need this kind of creative, challenging questions. Let's give a round of applause. Those are great questions. Thank you. So, first question was about the possibility to have breeding and really innovative ways to try to preserve the biodiversity. Maggie looks like she wants to try to tackle that one.
Yeah, It's a good question. So the part of that that I will tackle is what we are actively doing to try to work on restoration. And so you said it seemed like it was too late to preserve. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think there are some places where we can work on preserving what we still have to make sure that we keep those healthy ecosystems healthy. For example, places in the northern Red Sea that are super healthy, really nice, beautiful coral reefs that are functioning, we can work on protecting those. And that is something that the Kingdom is actively working on with NEOM projects and Shusha Island projects. In terms of what we're actually doing, this isn't, well, my group is doing a little bit of work on this, but some active things that are happening are, as I mentioned, there's the KCRI, KAUST Coral Restoration Initiative, and I believe later in the week you'll have someone from KCRI coming to be part of a panel talking about what they're doing to select corals and to outplant them and to grow them in different places around Shusha Island, which is the largest restoration or reefscaping effort that's happening globally. And so there are things that are happening in the Kingdom. There are folks at KAUST, researchers who are looking for more for species or individuals that are more adapted to warmer temperatures and using their genetics to try and figure out how to engineer corals that can withstand temperatures and perhaps use those in restoration efforts. And there are other applied and active restoration strategies that are happening by different groups at KAUST. So there are things in progress. You can look a little bit more into other active restoration projects or papers that might give you a little bit more insight about things that we're actively working on.
And you want to address the Gulf? There was a question about the Gulf.
Oh yeah, the Gulf. Well, Gulf is a fantastic area with fantastic corals. I mean, first of all, and the Gulf is one of those guiding lights. You say it's very polluted, and it's absolutely true, and it's very hot as well. I mean, you can find waters in the Gulf which are up to 36 degrees Celsius. It's like getting into a bath. Going into the Gulf in the summer in some places. And, but yet, there's still corals. I mean, it's incredible. And it advocates that corals can adapt to warm temperatures and they can do just fine. We also have this notion that corals don't like sediments and muddy water. You know, you need that sort of oligotrophic, meaning nutrient-free, incredible water clarity to have coral reefs. And then you go into the Gulf and the corals are like rolling around in this hot mud, and they're doing absolutely fine. They're doing fine. They've adapted. And there's no question that corals can adapt, so that's good news. And Jodie said that 2024, the year just passed, was the first time that every day of the year was above the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, which sounds very impressive. But as a geologist, I'm going to go one bigger than that. 65 million years ago, a meteorite hits the planet and the atmosphere catches fire. That's more than 1.5 degrees warming, yet the reef's still here. They're absolutely fine. There's no question that reefs can adapt. What we have to do is give them the space and the time to do that adaptation. And it's really, and Maggie said that earlier, from her work out in the Central Pacific, is if you just take away those ancillary impacts of overfishing and pollution, et cetera, those really sort of intense local human impacts, the reefs, they actually seem to do quite well with climate change. Their evidence is they can adapt. You've just got to leave them alone and allow them to go through that adaptation process. And that really comes back, I think, to the message of setting aside meaningful swaths of the ocean and just leaving it alone to undergo its own adaptation and recovery. It's probably, you're always going to get a better result by allowing the ecosystem to naturally adapt than trying to force feed it, through anthropogenic, through human manipulation in laboratories. We can learn a lot, but the organisms have had 200 million years to learn how to adapt, and we're now trying to say we're better than them at that in the last 2 decades, which is, of course, a ridiculous approach.
There are probably also, you asked a question about why don't we move some corals to the Black Sea or prepare them for moving to the Black Sea. It's not a crazy suggestion, and people are thinking about some of these more extreme options. There are places in terms of biodiversity where some species or their eggs are being kept, frozen in case maybe some point in the future we need to draw that as like a biobank and reintroduce them. The idea about moving something to a different part of the world where it doesn't occur right now is extremely controversial, because historically, when we've made those kind of movements, there's some ecological surprises that have not always been good things that have happened. However, given the extreme nature of the challenges that are being faced, there are real conversations about whether or not we should do these things. So that's not a bad idea. So thank you again for your question. I hope we answered everything for you.
Thank you.
And maybe we have time for one more, so thank you.
Hello. Throughout the panel, it was discussed that the corals are stressed and there are initiatives for coral restorations, and in 1,000 years later, the corals will be restored, not just right now. So would you entertain the idea of crustose coralline algae to actually be a replacement for reefs? Do they provide the everything reefs? They are hard, they can tolerate the temperature, harsh temperatures, so why won't they be a replacement for reef currently? Because right now we are alive and we are trying to find current solutions. So would you entertain this idea? Like, could they be a replacement?
I might throw that question back at you since you were in our marine life class, but I'm not going to. Okay, so my thoughts on that are that, first, not all coral and algal taxa are resilient to changes in temperature and pH and all that. So they're also being affected by changes in the environment. Second, they serve completely different ecological roles than corals. And so if we take a coral reef, like if you think about that first picture that I showed, and we erased all the coral and replaced it with coral and algae, that you would have the three-dimensional structure and the physical structure would continue accreting, but you would have completely different associated species. You wouldn't have the things that are eating coral, you wouldn't have the things that are living inside corals perhaps, and so it would be a completely different ecosystem. And so one of the things we're likely going to see is that, so Sam had mentioned that coral reefs have been around for a long time and they'll continue. The face of coral reefs will likely change. So who is there, who's most abundant, that is likely going to change as we go into the future. And so while I love the idea of a beautiful pink coral reef that's covered in coral and algae, that ecosystem and habitat would function completely different. And so perhaps it would be a reef that has some sort of job and is supporting some fisheries, but it would be very different than our coral reefs as we know them. Thank you.
And maybe if you have one last question, sorry, thank you, Jihan. For the yes.
Thank you very much for the interesting panel. Just wanted to follow up on a very interesting initiative you mentioned, so 30 by 30. I was just wondering generally, like especially in marine sciences, what's the general take on fish farms? Are they generally beneficial for sea life and marine life, or are they actually bad for them?
I guess is this on? Yes. The answer to that is, as with most answers, caveated pretty heavily. Aquaculture, cage farming of fish, whether that be onshore or offshore, is becoming a big thing. The growth of that industry is huge, particularly in this region of the world, also in the sort of Southeast Asia, China, etc. There are huge volumes of production of fish as a farmed resource rather than a wild-caught resource. In principle, that sounds great, obviously, reducing pressure on the natural environment, or at least the natural stocks. But there are a lot of questions around the impact that the production of fish like that has on the environment. A lot of that obviously is to do with runoff of waste products, whether that be from the fish itself, whether it be from, if they're using pharmaceuticals to treat disease in particularly caged fish, that's very common, or pesticides, chemicals, whatever it happens to be to improve the quality of the fish product, not necessarily very good for the environment itself. But it can be done in a relatively sustainable way. We see evidence of that. I guess salmon is probably one of the most well-known aquacultured fish. Certainly in Europe, it's a very big business. farmed very heavily in Norway and in Scotland, for example, and done in the kind of traditional sea cage setup. Lots of animals in a very confined space, lots of use of chemicals. But other countries like Ireland is, I guess, quite popular in that space, have moved to producing these animals in what they would term an organic way, essentially organic farming but for fish. And so that's using much lower stocking densities rather than using pharmaceutical interventions to deal with disease. It's using more natural interventions. So, for example, in salmon, the big one that people tend to talk about is sea lice. So the kind of collection and increasing abundance of these parasitic organisms that are natural in wild populations in low densities. In the big commercial farms, that's done pharmaceutically. In these organic farms, it's done by simply essentially exposing the fish to fresh water for a period of time. And the parasite can't survive the freshwater exposure, but the fish can. And so you're not, dumping chemicals into the environment in that way. And then there's also, things like mariculture, which again is increasingly common, and that's farming several species together, often a fish with, let's say, some form of algae and detritivore like sea cucumbers or something like that. Not super well developed in terms of, really expansive use yet, but that's certainly an emerging area in aquaculture. And the idea being that the different animals and plants that you're culturing will essentially feed off one another's waste. And so there's the idea is that there's less waste then that's released into the natural system. And so, it is a problem in large areas of the world where you have this really intensive farming, but there are ways around that, and there are countries that are very interested in developing those further.
Thank you.
Okay, really, last question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Yusuf Sioni. My question is about what conservation efforts are currently in place to protect these coral ecosystems.
What current protections are in place?
What current conservation efforts are taking place to protect these coral ecosystems?
What current conservation efforts are in place? Who wants to jump on that? Do you want to?
Well, I guess, we have large areas around the world that are already cordoned off as marine protected areas. In the Great Barrier Reef, we've got various levels of protection. So you might not know, but some areas of the 2,300 kilometer stretch along the east coast of Australia that is the largest continuous reef on the world, some areas can be fished. Some areas can have large coal tankers going through them, so it's not ideal. Other areas are completely hands-off. No one can be in them whatsoever. So I think what we're looking at is looking at some of these areas that are already protected and evolving some of these protections to be more stringent, to better protect those coral reefs from the secondary and the tertiary, the extra stressors that they might face, like boat traffic or fishing or runoff, because they're all facing that warming already. But if we can get those extra stressors off of their day-to-day, then that's going to offer extra protection. So looking for those examples around the world, and that's my backyard, that's where I can speak. Looking at those examples around the world where certain areas of coral reefs are protected and how many layers of protection they have.
I'll just add to that what's happening right now in Saudi Arabia is that there are several entities which are looking very closely at these types of models from around the world and trying to understand what are the most effective and appropriate types of conservation efforts to bring here very soon. And so there are a variety of different types of efforts, and I think that I'll say that all the developments on the coast, NEOM, Amala, the Red Sea Global Project, they're all looking very closely at what are the right ways to develop strong management plans to help protect those environments. And so I think actually there are pretty good reasons to be optimistic. We've seen lots of discussion about cool technologies that can help, getting the right messaging out there, focusing on education. And I think all of those things are happening in the background right now in Saudi. And I think we should be optimistic that despite the environmental pressures that are coming, there are still reasons to be hopeful. And we need people like you to learn more and get trained and then help us. We need hundreds of people helping us doing this here. So I hope that this has been an interesting session for you all. We're going to wrap it up so that we can get you guys out of here on time. Let's give a big round of applause to our panelists. And I think I have to tell them that they can't leave yet because I do have gifts for them. So as a token of our appreciation for your participation, we're going to give each of them one of our famous KAUST astrolabes. So thank you, Jodie.
All right, guys, I know we're all excited for the food, but very quickly, you got an announcement on your phone about a trip that's going to happen on Friday and Saturday to El Beled. That's going to be really fun, but you're going to have to register in advance. And please remember to check out. They told me you have a 5-minute window to check out. So good luck and enjoy the food as well as I will do right now. Thank you.